Welcome back to the Energy Sovereignty Project and our closeout for October, this being our fourth week. So the interesting thing about this closeout for the week is that we had a PG&E power outage to go through. Now, we didn't have the outage affect us here at the project because, again, as we've discussed before, we're in that Sacramento Municipal Utilities District area, not in PG&E. But what I did do is that when we got the notification that PG&E was going to turn the power off, I think it was about a day or two before they actually did. We'll go back to the studio in a minute and take a look at that. But a day or two before the power went out for anybody in that PG&E area, we went into zombie apocalypse mode. I turned the system off. And again, this is part of a separate video that we'll be doing specifically about how to get past the PG&E outages. So watch for that as well. But the interesting thing that I wanted to show everybody was the difference between running something like a generator and running solar power for that period of time. And we'll take a look at some things like fuel consumption. What does your generator run on? Does it run on gas? Does it run on natural gas, piped in, or propane? So we'll take a look at some generator options and see how long they would have run versus what we wind up with when we choose a solar option. But for the closeout of this week, let's go back to the studio and take a look at some of the numbers and see how the system did during that period where we had the power outage. Well, this week we have a bit of an interesting week to go over. So if you are one of those folks that usually just sticks around for the introduction to find out what was going on in the week, you may actually want to go ahead and have a look through this video as well as next week's video. What happened is that we actually had a period where there were massive PG&E shutoffs, power shutoffs, for quite a bit of the middle to the end of October, starting around the October 9th or so, I think was where they got their first one. So the reason that makes this kind of interesting to look at in totality is that from the 23rd onward, we actually mimicked what was going on elsewhere. In other words, we were basically off of the grid because we were doing some tests. I'll go through that when we first start us off, but in the third week of October, you'll remember we had some issues with a firmware update, and so we were already turning the grid off as part of trying to figure out what was going on with the firmware. And so while we were doing those tests, PG&E started turning off the power all over California. So we thought, okay, well, this is a great opportunity then to go ahead and shut our power off and then see how long we would be able to have ridden out a prolonged power outage. So let's go ahead and start to get into that because it's kind of interesting. So let's get into the chronicle of the shutdown, shall we? Okay, so here is obviously October 22nd. The 22nd starts us off where we left off in our last update. We had already gotten word that the shutdown was coming, and we were just waiting to see if it was really going to happen. As you can see by the red mile number of the car there, we were on our last day of driving that we'd started using those supercharger miles because, again, of that software fault that we had with the Tesla Gateway. So in case you didn't see that video, we had an upgrade that had been done by Tesla to the firmware, but due to a mistake, it left the system trying to charge the batteries to full from grid power, even though we didn't have the storm watch setting engaged at the time. So let's go over the numbers for the 22nd quick, and then I'll talk a little bit about those anomalies that we were still having. So good production for the day. As you can see, this time of year we start to see some of that fall off. So what we're seeing here is 33.1 kilowatt hours, pretty good. Home usage was about typical, 17.6 kilowatt hours, and then because of the software fault, we were charged to 100% on the 20th, and so you can see the remnants of that still. We're just kind of bouncing back and forth between that 80s to 90s in the morning after running the house all night, and then ending the total solar day at 100%, as we're still trying to export to the grid. And so in this case, we wound up sending 17.6 kilowatt hours to the grid. And then this brings us to that anomaly. So on the 22nd, I tried a test where I turned the system back to grid power, and then I monitored it. Well, here's a screenshot, and then let me walk you through a little bit about what you're seeing, because it get a little confusing here. So at some point around 10 a.m., just prior to that spike that you're seeing there, I tested the system to see if it was still trying to draw power from the grid. I knew from speaking with Tomas and Lee that their storm watch settings were still engaged on their systems, and so if we had storm watch on our system, that it would then try and pull from the grid. And so I think, again, that was where that fault in the firmware was, is that for whatever reason it just didn't tell you that it didn't let the system know that you had storm watch shut off, and so then if you turn the grid on, it would try to charge. So initially when I checked it, it was fine. It had been a couple of days, and I'd already contacted Tesla with the problem. They said that they were aware of it, and so I figured that it was probably fixed. And so and in retrospect, it was probably just likely that the reason that it hadn't been drawing off of 100% was because, again, we're always keeping the system for that week up around that 100% level, and so it probably just never tried to draw off. Hard to say, but obviously that doesn't explain the evening. But at any rate, so shortly after I turned on the house power, I plugged the car in for a charge, and so I hadn't given it much thought there. If the grid wasn't trying to power the house to maintain the battery, then it was probably fine, right? Well, so as you can see from that spike there, as soon as I plugged the car in, that 15 kilowatt draw immediately started to pull all of that from the grid instead of from the batteries, and it had pulled about, as you can see there, pulled about 5 kilowatt hours from the grid before I noticed what was going on, and then I unplugged the grid. But so here's the strange thing, though. That evening, you'll see that spike around 2 p.m. there. And so that was me attempting to repeat that same test at 2 p.m. and it was fine. So I don't know. So as you can see there, it didn't take power from that, and so then I figured, okay, well, let's go ahead and then we'll leave it on overnight, and we'll watch it. Well, so here, let's take a quick look at the notes for the 22nd, and then I'll pull up a magnification of the morning of the 23rd. So here's the notes. I'll give you just a second with that. Basically, it's just kind of the vehicle data, and then we'll move on, as the notes just basically repeat what I just told you. So now here we have the screenshot from the morning of the 23rd. So if you look at this, you'll see these strange spikes that are occurring. So overall for the day, these spikes where it draws from the grid, it wasn't inconsequential. It amounted to about 1.7 kilowatt hours pulled needlessly from the grid at a time when the batteries had plenty of power. And so that was odd. And so then what I wound up doing, you'll see there at 8 p.m. where flat lines, right? So at 8 p.m. I wound up turning the grid power off again at 8 p.m. and that's why you see these kind of confusing icons here. So let me go ahead and pull up the log for the 23rd. So what you'll see here at the top, that you'll see that it's got both the zombie apocalypse mode, which means that we had the grid turned off, as well as that grid sharing icon. And again, that represents the fact that on the 23rd we were still doing this weird test where in order to make sure that I maximized the amount of power that went to the grid, I would leave the grid off and until we got right to the point where we started contributing with solar. Then I would go ahead and re-engage the grid, allow the power to then go to the grid, and then as soon as we were done contributing for the day, boop, turned it back off. And so sorry to have that kind of confusing there. So but as you can see, good day of production, 32 kilowatt hours. Total home use for that day was also 32 kilowatt hours. So basically a kind of a break even day there. And so then the notes for the 23rd. We knew we were going to have some overage or surplus power created on the 24th, and so then just as we did for the 23rd, and so we were going to need to make sure that we had some place to put it, and that was why we put that 12 kilowatt hours that you see there to the vehicle. And I'll give you just a second with that. And so then that brings us to the 24th. And the 24th, we also wound up having a bit of strangeness there. As you can see, the anomaly is now what I consider to be rather serious, because there's some strange issue with that with this firmware edition, that it's somehow causing a significant inflow and outflow. And we'll go over that later in the week for the next day, because again, on this day we're still kind of messing around with the system, turning it off and on briefly as part of our tests. But as for the other stats, they just kind of show that we're easily able to maintain a self-powered mode. The daily production again was 32.5 kilowatts. Daily usage was 18.2 kilowatt hours, and this allowed us to bank a considerable amount of power since we didn't charge the car that day, and that left us with a total surplus. Wound up being able to charge the system to 97% by the end of total solar day. And here are the notes. No power sent to the vehicle today, and then over the course of the next couple of days we'll wind up turning the grid power on again only briefly to perform a couple of tests. But we're trying to examine this strange grid inflow and outflow. And so on the 25th, again, the majority of the day was spent with the grid switched off. 1.6 kilowatt hours you see there is listed as from the grid, was a result of those brief tests that we were doing around 9 a.m. to see if the system was still malfunctioning, and it was. And it still attempted to draw power from the grid when you plugged in a heavy load, in this case the car. And even though Stormwatch was turned off, it kept trying to do that. And so then today we do 2 vehicle charges, one in the morning and then another one in the evening. And this time, once power was switched off in the evening at we would go ahead and leave it off actually into November. And so here are the notes. As the notes say, right after that successful test, the grid was shut back off. I'll give you a minute with that. And then the 26th. So now here is where it starts to get interesting for a couple of reasons. So firstly, with the decision now to just go ahead and leave the grid shut off until Tesla gets their software fixed, we were able to see how the system would perform if it were subject to the same power outages that had just occurred in Nevada City and the surrounding areas up there. And so what we were going to do is we were going to go ahead and also remain without power as long as their power was off. And so the other reason that this is interesting here is that it allows us to take a closer look at that firmware anomaly. So for this day, we have lots of driving. Started the day at 56%, we wind up at 12%, and that after putting 32 kilowatt hours to the car to cover that driving. And then you have again daily consumption, daily production of 30 kilowatt hours and a daily consumption of 20.9. We managed to bank 10 kilowatt hours surplus, and so then that brought the total solar day percentage to 33%. And here is the notes. So a fun set of notes for the day. So we'd driven to the Bay Area for a Halloween party, but the party was actually canceled because of that power outage that had happened. And so instead we wound up staying with the folks that had invited us to the party, and they have a power wall installed at their home, so we were the only ones on the block with our lights on, so that was fun. And so here we have the 27th. So with the party a bust, I had to do a little bit of around town driving that previous night, and to get to the friend's place and such. So I didn't have quite enough power to fully make the round trip, so I wound up putting just enough supercharger miles into the car to cover that shortfall, and that's those miles in red there. And so then we returned home and put 20 kilowatt hours to the vehicle right away. And this obviously represents more than that 7% drop that you see there from the total solar day, and that's because while we were charging, the sun was also shining, and so part of that 20 kilowatt hours went directly from solar to the car instead of going to the batteries first, and so that also relieves some of the losses that occur since it's going straight into the car. But good day of production, 33.5 kilowatt hours of production, and a typical reduced daily usage for this time of year, 16.5 kilowatt hours. There wasn't any heat or AC being used. This time of year is relatively neutral, and so that brings that usage down considerably. And the notes, basically just what I said. Go ahead and give you a few seconds with that. Go ahead and pause it if you need to read it over. And then the 28th. And so again, with the home producing quite a bit more than it used, production of 32.8 kilowatt hours with a total use of 29.3 kilowatt hours, and that includes that 12 kilowatt hours to the car that you see here. And so note, really, this is really important here. Note that daily to the grid. So now we see the issue as serious as it is, because this is the first day where our grid power has been shut off for that full 24 hours now. So where the hell did that power go? It sure as hell didn't go to the grid. The grid's disconnected. And so now this creates an error that is going to accumulate and eventually become a healthy disparity between what our utility provider says went to them and what Tesla says went to them. So come on, Tesla, you need to get this fixed. That's a serious anomaly. And again, for those that have been following the Energy Sovereignty Project for a while, you know that this is a new occurrence. We've done this many times before, and every time when we have the grid power disengaged, it's 0-0. You don't see anything in and out. So I'm not really sure what's going on with that, but it's something that they do need to attend to. And so here are the notes. Basically just that, keeping track of how many days this keeps happening. Obviously for, like I said, those who have been following us, this is a new thing, and so I'm sure there's lots of things that Tesla's wrestling with in the background of all of this, maybe other equipment compliance issues and that kind of thing, but it's still annoying. So. And on the 29th, so remember that I told you this time of year was neutral and we didn't need the heat? Well, today was the first time the heater was kicking on kind of a significant amount there. We didn't use much heat really, so the circulating fans weren't on all that much, but they were on, so we recorded this in that icon there. At only 15.6 kilowatt hours of usage, though, it really hasn't started to show very much yet. But we did produce 32.4 kilowatt hours. But because we started the day at only 7%, we decided to go ahead and supercharge the car to handle our out-of-town driving for the day rather than pull that off of the home. And the notes, just that, supercharging to cover some out-of-town driving rather than pull it off the system. And again, the main reason for that is this seasonal change that we have here. And so as we enter our normal rainy season, we like to keep a bit of a higher percentage. I think that's prudent. That's what we did early on in the Energy Sovereignty Project as well, for the same reason, to kind of get us past any cloudy days that might come by. So I had a lot to write there, so I'll give you just a moment there with those notes. And again, feel free to pause if you need a little more time. And then that brings us to the 30th, still running on supercharger miles. As you can see, the home usage is creeping up just a little. The circulating fans are on a bit more often as the heater's going. Total usage of 17 kilowatt hours, and that's with, again, no charge to the car. Daily production of 30.8 kilowatt hours, so we're still able to bank a considerable amount of power into the system, starting the day at 12% and ending at 48%. And you can see also that half a kilowatt hour is that anomaly is still with us, reading that false reading to the grid power. And the notes, again, just that, showing that we're aware of the persistent glitch, and we're going to keep track of this as long as we can, but it'll be more difficult to sort this out in November because we'll have to turn the system back on to grid power. And with the grid shut off, it gives us a cleaner measure of that error, but with the grid on, it'll be more difficult to tease out. And then Halloween. Again, good day of production, 31.4 kilowatt hours produced, 16.7 kilowatt hours used, and again that allowed us to bank a considerable amount of power, starting the day at 34% and then ending the day at 58%. And the notes. And with that, it brings October to a close. The PG&E outages, for the most part, ended on the 30th. There were a few pocket areas that didn't get power back until the 31st. But here's why it'll be interesting for folks to actually tune in and follow through next week's update as well. And that is because we're going to leave the system off. We're just going to go ahead and let it run. And so then next week we'll see how far we get. At some point in November, we're really going to start to lose the sun angle, and we're no longer going to be able to meet our daily usage of the home. I expect ultimately at some point mid to late November we'll probably start to peel down to a point where we're only going to wind up being able to produce maybe 25 kilowatt hours of power in a day. So we'll see how that goes. But hope you found that interesting, and as always, I wish you all the best with your own systems. And if this is the kind of thing that you enjoy, if you've stumbled onto this video, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.